Hello, welcome to Scrum Rituals by myself, Elizabeth Blythe, and my associate, Kylie Findlay. We work together at Fire Monkey Studios. Would you like to move to the next one? So I have been in games for approximately 1 year, which is the reason I wanted to bring Kylie in, because she's been around a lot longer than I have. But in the past, I've worked as a producer at Summerfall Studios, and now I'm a development director at Fire Monkeys. And all the rest is kind of like the credentials and the reasons why I feel comfortable having this discussion about Scrum ceremonies. Kylie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, I'm Kylie. I have completed a Bachelor of Game Design at Griffith University. I've been working in games for about 9 years. Started out in QA, doing contract work at various studios such as the Voxel Agents. Then I became a full-time QA at Tourist Games for a couple of years. Then finally landed QA at Fire Monkeys on Real Racing 3. After a couple of years in that role, I moved into the development director role, also on Real Racing 3, and I've been there for about 6 years now.
It's a pleasure working with you. Shall we move to the next slide? All right, for this session, we will do a quick review of Agile and Scrum for context before we jump into the individual Scrum ceremonies. For each Scrum ceremony, we'll do a quick who, what, when, why, and how. And you're going to have 2 Scrum Masters that work in games, comparing and contrasting how we go about our delivery. Shall I get to the next slide? We want to start off with a little bit of a reminder about what is Agile. Agile is a philosophy that originated in software development in the 1990s, but it has roots as far back as the 1970s. In 2001, 12 software developers came together to write the Agile Manifesto. It's a statement of 4 overarching values with 12 principles beneath it. Agile itself is not a delivery methodology, but it's an underlying set of values and principles that serve several frameworks and methodologies, such as Scrum, Rapid Application Development, and Lean. The original Scrum Guide, written by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sonnen, actually predates the publishing of the Agile Manifesto, and they co-presented Scrum at the Uppsala conference in 1995. So why is it so popular, and why is Agile used? Agile became important in the marketplace because the traditional project delivery methods, primarily out of the construction industry, were ill-suited for the delivery of software. In construction, what you're trying to build is concrete and can be predetermined with far more accuracy than, say, the user experience of a game. It was also built for market disruption. It was the answer to how does a company with a limited amount of time and resources break into a market of bigger players with more resources quickly and start getting paid while they learn and refine their ideas. Basically, there was a need to deliver value quickly to compete. Next slide. Scrum is one of the practices of Agile. It uses the empirical process to learn and adapt your delivery process to your team's needs. It focuses on 3 pillars of transparency, inspection, and adaptation. All the Scrum rituals are designed to fulfill either one or more of these pillars. So as you are going along through the Scrum operating rhythm, you can think about, are we trying to understand something about what we're doing? Are we trying to adapt to what we have already done? And things of that nature. Next slide. All right, so this is an example that shows you how traditional projects come together and how Agile projects come together using, for example, the Scrum methodology. As you can see, in a traditional delivery model, you have requirements phase, design phase, implementation phase, and verification phase. From requirements to verification is a very long process. So the Agile process tries to shorten that and reduce risk of going astray by doing little increments of requirements, design, implementation, and verification in each sprint. This is a risk management method, and it also ensures the delivery of value early. Next. As we've discussed, it's the empirical process with the pillars of transparency, inspection, and adaptation. There are other elements of Scrum that surround the Scrum ceremonies that are of key importance. It's important to know that these are merely the practices of Scrum, and one of the key ways that Scrum tends to go wrong is through going through the motions without understanding the underlying principles. Because this presentation is focused around the ceremonies themselves, however, this slide is to recommend further investigation and deeper understanding of Scrum. For example, the concept of multidisciplinary, self-organizing team, where everyone on the team is responsible for achieving the required work. We're not going into that when we just talk about the Scrum ceremonies, but those things are an Agile principle. There's also the concept of a minimum viable product, delivering increments of potentially releasable software to reduce risks of value loss if the market changes and the delivery of work needs to stop. This links traditional risk management and benefits realization. There's also the concept of time boxing, which creates focus and thereby battles Parkinson's law to deliver efficiently. It's also important to know that there are several activities that we do that are common in Agile delivery that are not necessarily Scrum per se. For example, the Scrum Guide, ironically, does not mention panning poker or velocity, and yet both those are tools that you'll often see when you're delivering an Agile project. So, whereas it is always possible to add to Scrum to build out the Scrum framework into a full delivery methodology, if you remove any of the rituals or activity from Scrum, then the result is deemed to not be Scrum. Next slide. So what does Scrum look like? An idea can come from anywhere: the team, stakeholders, and output from previous iteration. But they should all align with the product vision or goals, which is managed by the product owner. Ideas that are accepted are added to the product backlog to become product backlog items. Product backlog items are broken down into a detailed backlog during backlog refinement. And during sprint planning, backlog items are selected for the next sprint and further broken into tasks. Sprints are time box periods which last between 1 and 4 weeks, and they have a daily stand-up for monitoring. At the end of a sprint, we hold a sprint review, and the team demos the product increment. A sprint retrospective shortly follows that cycle and begins again with sprint planning. At the end of a sprint, the product owner may or may not choose to release the increment completed in the previous sprint. Next. So, sprint planning. First, there's who. The entire team will participate with this. That's the Scrum Master, the product owner, and all developers. They may also bring in subject matter experts that can come in and help inform or answer questions. So what is it that they're trying to do? The team is putting together a high-level delivery plan for the sprint, which is also called the sprint plan or the sprint backlog. The inputs are the product backlog items that were marked of highest importance. Sprint goals, often formulated with the team in the sprint planning, but based on a product roadmap or strategy. And in order to be a plan, it should break down what tasks need to be shown, as known at the time. Generally, you want to know about how long those tasks will take, what order the tasks need to be completed in. And in particular, the team does not need to know everything, and they should not get bogged down where they just don't have enough information. This can be reported as a blocker and have a task to actually sort out the information or do more investigation. The sprint plan can be adjusted throughout the sprint with the help of the product owner. There is a proportional time box for this meeting based on the length of the sprint: 8 hours for a month-long sprint, 4 hours for a fortnightly sprint, and 2 hours for a weekly sprint. Why are we sprint planning? Sprint planning helps the team know what needs to be done, whether or not it can be done, and what dependencies there are between tasks as they move through the work. It provides them with a map from start to finish, albeit they acknowledge that they might not know everything. They need to know enough to shake out big issues and risks, including whether or not the work asked for will fit in the release. This is the opportunity for the team to shape the expectation of what they're delivering with the product owner. And this is where we get into the fun part, where we can compare and contrast how 2 different Scrum Masters might go about sprint planning. Kylie, do you mind going first?
Yeah, sure. A couple of things to note before I start. As I mentioned, I work on Real Racing 3, which is a mobile service game that ships updates roughly every 6 weeks, so it's pretty fast paced. And like Elizabeth said earlier, this is going to be skewed toward the Scrum Master perspective because I'm the development director. All right, sprint planning. So to kick off sprint planning, the product owner presents the sprint goals to the team at the beginning of the meeting. You may need more than one planning session depending on the size of your team. It's completely up to you to find what suits. Once that's done, there's usually 2 scenarios at play. The product owner will come prepared with a list of tasks in priority order, or if we're working on a major feature, we would look through all the highest priority tasks for that feature and decide whether we should start as a team. Decide where we should start as a team. The second scenario will also likely include some tasks that are critical to ship for that update. As we move through each task on the list, the owner of said task will give a high-level summary of what it is, and the team is free to ask any clarifying questions. In case you don't, then we do a first pass on estimates using planning poker. In case you don't know what that is, it's essentially a quick way to gauge if the team is aligned on the size of a task. You have cards with numbers representing the Fibonacci sequence, which we call story points. Once everyone puts down a number, you can see if we are aligned on the size of a task. If one team member puts down a 2 and another puts down an 8, it provokes more discussion because it means they have wildly different ideas about how big the task is. It can take a few sprints for new members to become comfortable with this method, as it's all relative to the team's previous work. Once you have enough story points to fill the sprint, a number that would have been determined from previous sprints, then you can move on to task breakdown. On my team, the breakdown is heavily dominated by engineering tasks, but other members such as design and UI should also be involved as well. This is when you would get the actual day estimates, and you should have a pretty clear idea of how scoped your sprint is by this point, and if you need to add or remove any tasks. Lastly, always keep in mind that you should leave in buffer room for work found during the sprint.
So in contrast, typically to prepare for sprint planning, I set up a whiteboard or a mirror board and do a little bit of bring in a pre-room backlog, the product roadmap and strategy, and a few potential sprint goals that I've worked out with the product owner prior, and the agreed actions from the previous retro. First, with the team, we would determine the sprint goals. So if I came in with like 3 potential sprint goals, we might choose one and refine it, and then we'll discuss what the highest value items that the product owner wants into the team to develop during the sprint. So for example, we might say, here's the things that are of value, here's what the sprint goals might be, which ones align with the things that we're going to pull into the sprint. Once the sprint goal and the PBI items are agreed, I would guide the team to do 3 passes. The first pass, we put all the tasks required that we know of in or down on a board with order of magnitude estimates onto sticky notes. Next, we sequence the tasks and draw lines from one to the next where each task is dependent on another task. And finally, we assign those tasks to folks. At the moment, we're using mirror boards instead of whiteboards, but it works the same way for us either way. You should walk out with a high-level delivery plan that we end up using in our daily Scrum. So there you have it, the way 2 different Scrum Masters go about delivering the sprint plan. So let's talk about the daily Scrum. So who? The development team, and often, but not always, the Scrum Master. Usually I would be there. The activity is owned by the development team, and it can look a number of different ways. I've had teams where we've actually played through the game. I've had teams where we just go and look at the sprint plan and we go, which ones can we check off and which ones are going next? And then we've had the normal 3 questions. What are you doing today? What did you do yesterday? And do you have any issues or blockers? It really depends on the team and what we need. Generally, it's supposed to be understood that the team owns the Scrum. So I usually say, if I'm not going to be there, I expect this to happen anyway. And I might even talk to the team and see who do they want otherwise to facilitate the meeting. So potentially there might be somebody else that whenever I'm not around, it is their responsibility to do it, or we would have some sort of agreement prior. What we're trying to get. The daily Scrum is a time box meeting of 15 minutes, but it can look like anything that the team needs to be. It's typically congregated around either a Kanban board or a storyboard or something that represents the sprint plan. Why do we do it? The purpose of the daily Scrum is to inspect the work that is being done and to understand how it is progressing against sprint plan. So it may not be a physical inspection. It could just be, where's that task at? Is it a binary? Is it done? Is it not done? Are there any issues or blockers? But you just want to know where you're at. You want to detect blockers and issues and determine whether the team needs to adjust their course to achieve the plan. Rarely, the team may detect from these sessions that they need to rework the plan or to negotiate a change of scope with the product owner. Frequently, they will report blockers and determine with whom to speak and to resolve them. The session also ensures that the team has FaceTime access to one another at least once per day, and ensures that all team members are exposed to a high level awareness of where the plan is at any one point in time, and also how their work currently relates to the work of another. And it allows them to be proactive about resolving blockers and dependencies. Kylie, would you like to kick off the how we go about it?
Yeah, sure. We call them stand-ups on my team, so that's how I'll be referring to it. Okay. Considering the current world situation, I thought I'd describe scenarios for when working physically in a space together or working remotely. When all physically sharing a space, the team would gather around a whiteboard with all the sprint tasks on it. Each team member has a chance to explain what they did yesterday, what they're working on today, and if they're blocked by anything. As their tasks are discussed, they move any relevant post-it notes over to its new status on the board. Once stand-up is over, all team members would go back to their desks and ensure all their tasks are updated in the digital tracking tool. We use Jira on our team. When working remotely, it's still a similar format. In the meeting each day, we have a standard order that each person speaks and discusses their current tasks. However, the main difference would be that a person is nominated to share their screen and display the digital sprint board. In our case, it's the lead engineer. It's been really successful for us, as I think it's important to keep that visual feedback. Some points to consider for both scenarios. The meeting should kick off at the same time in the morning and ideally last for 15 minutes. If anyone is expanding on their tasks for a bit too long, I advise you to figure out how best to cut them short. I usually say something like, let's park that for now and discuss at the end of stand up if I want to be involved, so that people who don't want to be involved can leave, or ask them to take it offline and discuss it amongst themselves. And stand up is also a good place to keep the team updated on what you're currently working on, or if you have any announcements to share. That's it.
Thanks. All right, so for myself, I usually prepare for the daily scrum by determining what work is there and whom I need to call on in cohorts. So before the meeting, I've done a little bit of work. I use an Excel spreadsheet to record my yesterday, today, and tomorrow notes, and I don't show that to anyone. It's just kind of sitting on my computer. I typically would raise any project announcements to the team, and I usually kick off myself with what I did yesterday, what I did today, and what I am doing tomorrow. And it's just kind of to role model the kind of responses I want. Next, I'll call on people to give their updates in a similar manner, organized to the work. So for example, if we had a specific deliverable that 3 people were working on, I would focus on those 3 people together as a cohort. If I'm not getting the information I need to understand where the work is at, whether we have any issues that we need to address, et cetera, I might thank them and then gently follow up with some questions like, thanks for that, are there any issues? Or thanks for that, are we still on target for Friday? As we go through the work, I would remind people to update the board that they have. After the daily scrum, I often book 15 minutes in my diary to determine and record any action items that have come out of the stand-up, including following up with people or making certain that something has happened, or to try to find something out that I didn't uncover during the daily scrum that I should have. And that's it for me. All right, the next item, sprint review. So who? The sprint review includes the Scrum team, that's the product owner, Scrum Master, and development team, and also any other stakeholders that are pertinent or care to attend. What? The sprint review is held towards the end of the sprint, and participants discuss how the sprint went. They are, in essence, reviewing the sprint. They'll inspect what work was done and explain what was not done and why. The product owner will discuss the product backlog as it stands as a result of the sprint, and any market changes or events that eventuated during the sprint or might change the order of the product backlog. They may use this time to review budgets, timelines, and the current status of the product backlog, and any value or timing of future activities. Why is this held? This meeting is one of the main strategic meetings used to engage with the wider stakeholder audience, allowing both the product owner to ask questions and understand the product direction. It is also a key meeting for backlog grooming. Kylie, would you like to kick off about how you do sprint review?
Yep. So we kick sprint review off with a quick presentation that outlines the following: what our goals were and a casual discussion about if we achieved them, a list of tasks we committed to, and if we finish them, if there's any outstanding work. Then if we have another sprint immediately after this one, we may have a sneak peek at what the next set of goals will be. But really, sprint review is a chance for the team to demonstrate all the tasks they worked on throughout the sprint. Once the admin is out of the way, each team member will show off their work in a recent build to give everyone the opportunity to ask questions and give feedback. It's a great time to celebrate the team and everyone's accomplishments during an iteration. So we usually have this meeting on a Friday afternoon while everyone is winding down just before the weekend. Any outstanding work is captured by product owner or the Scrum Master, and they would update the associated tasks before the next sprint.
So the sprint review is where I typically deviate the most from the current Scrum process. So you might want to take some of this with a grain of salt. Typically in the daily Scrum, I remind the team that we have sprint review that day, so that way they're prepared to demo their PBIs and any work that they've completed during the sprint. And I also remind the product owner to bring the product backlog, roadmap, and anything else that they need to sprint review. During the meeting, I generally do a short introduction about how the sprint went according to my notes, and then I'd hand the sprint review over to the team to showcase what work they've completed. They're also requested or reminded to raise anything they specifically did not complete. After that, the product owner will typically pull out the backlog and the product roadmap and strategy, and we'll discuss what they'll most likely put into sprint planning and forward plan any dates or key things stakeholders should be aware of. This is sort of like the first pass refinement for me in the product, or for the sprint planning next sprint. When I started Scrum years ago, the sprint review sat more on the side of being about showcasing the work rather than discussing the next sprint. These days, sprint reviews sit more strongly in the holistic view of the sprint with an aim of grooming the product backlog. However, because I still lean on wanting to inspect things earlier, I personally don't like holding sprint review at the very end of the sprint. I usually finalize backlog grooming outside of sprint review, either right before or right after. So for me, the sprint ends on a Friday. I'll typically hold sprint review a few days earlier to give the Scrum team and product owner time to absorb and react to whatever feedback and comments have come out of it, and whether or not we need to go deeper on any PBIs than we typically do with the stakeholder audience. I find if we wait until the very end of the sprint for this, there's a chance that we won't have any opportunity to manage or react to anything that goes awry. So we're just calling the sprint done or near done, even though it's not quite there for me. So that's something that I personally just do. All right, retrospective. Who? The product owner, Scrum Master, and development team typically come together for the retrospective, and it's frequently facilitated by the Scrum Master. The retrospective is the point at which the Scrum team comes together to honestly look at places where they could do better, then adapt by prioritizing changes to the way they'll work into the next sprint, and become truly adaptive to the team's needs. When working at pace, the retrospective is one of the only places that will get the team to pause and think about their approach, and if something needs to change. It's important to note that these changes are considered a hypothesis, to be tested, data collected, and then to be re-reviewed during the next retrospective. To hold a retrospective, usually a meeting will be set at the very end of the sprint where the team will discuss what problems were had, what risks could happen, and how they should adjust their process. The result of the meeting should be a prioritized list of potential actions that the team can commit to implementing into the next sprint. Kylie, you want to take it away?
Yeah. So the retrospective is an opportunity for the team to inspect itself and create some action items to improve our workflow in the next sprint. I like to use a framework that has a higher likelihood of producing feedback that is actionable. I find that a retrospective that only focuses on positives and negatives means people usually just share a lot of praise for each other and complain about things outside of your control. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy for the team to share praise for each other, but it's important to also discuss things that are working well. So my go-to streams are, what should we keep doing, what should we stop doing, and what should we start doing? When in the office, we would all get in a room and write things down on post-it notes to put on a board. But in the absence of that, we have tried using a Google form so that people could submit their feedback ahead of time. And then I read through it and discuss it in the meeting. More recently, we have been using a tool called Miro, which Elizabeth mentioned earlier, which is essentially a virtual whiteboard, if you haven't heard of it. So that medium has allowed us to have a similar atmosphere to what we did in the office and feels more organic and honestly just a bit more fun. I give it on about 10 minutes to write down their notes. Then I read through each item individually. As I go through, I usually ask who gave the feedback and if they want to expand on it at all. As I'm facilitating, and then anyone else in the team is free to add their input as well. As I'm facilitating, I listen to what people are saying and try to provide potential solutions and identify any action items. And when the meeting is over, I make sure to keep a record of all the comments on our Confluence and action what I can. That's it.
So there are so many ways to retro that I love it when teams mix it up a bit. I've seen fun activities like Retros Against Humanity and a sailboat where people put sticky notes to represent the wind, the anchors, and the icebergs. I plan to learn from this in my future retros. At the risk of admitting to how boring I can be, I typically do the following without fail. First, I'll pre-prepare by putting 3 headers on a whiteboard or the Miro board labeled stop/start and continue. I figure out some sort of icebreaker question, kind of like, it's Saturday night on an 8 p.m. What am I likely to catch you doing? And then I get some post-it notes and pass them out to the team. And if it's a small group, we might just sit around with coffee and biscuits. Generally, I then facilitate in rounds. The first round, I'll ask the icebreaker question. This is about building the team's knowledge of one another and giving them comfort to speak, like just, getting them calm and ready to go into some maybe more hairy things that might have gone wrong. I'll ask each person how they felt about the week. I call that a heartbeat, and I just say, how did it go last week in your estimation? And then next, I'll ask each person, what did we do well? And then I'll ask other team members if they had a Post-it note that matches that to pass them over, and then I'll group all of those Post-its together. Or if it's on a board, I'll just ask them to put their Post-its down next to the ones that have already been laid. I'll ask each person to come up with one item at least that we could do better. This is kind of like that stop-start thing. And then again, I'll ask other teams if they have a similar Post-it note to pass that over or place it down. Finally, as people are talking, I too am recording potential action items. At the end, I will validate with the team which of the actions we feel confident we can implement for the next sprint. And then I just bring those to sprint planning. Backlog refinement. Backlog refinement is owned by the product owner, but the Scrum Master will often assist the product owner, and the team may also be involved. Why are you doing it? The purpose of backlog grooming is to understand which items of the product backlog have the most value, and therefore the highest priority for development in the next sprint. Excellent backlog grooming allows the product owner and the development team to understand their minimum viable product and the high-level path of increments that will help them get there. There may or may not be a resulting roadmap for certain product backlog items. What? Typically intended to take only 10% of a sprint from the development team, backlog grooming requires the following: an understanding of the market and audience, a resulting product strategy, and an awareness of the status of the team. Ultimately, the team needs to accept that work into the sprint. They may or may not need to work with the team or Scrum Master to break down particularly big product backlog items to fit into a minimum viable product. Typically, this is why an activity that the product owner is doing throughout the sprint, and it has specific checkpoints with the team, particularly during sprint review. Kylie, would you like to go into how you go about backlog refinement?
Yep, sure. So our backlog grooming meeting takes place shortly before the sprint begins to ensure we have a well-defined list of tasks ready to discuss for sprint planning. The product owner will have done a preliminary pass on the priorities so that anything required for this release is already marked as critical. There's usually a representative from each discipline present, as it's important for them to be aware of what work is coming up in case they need to flesh out any of the task requirements. It also gives them some time to finalize pre-production, and it's really useful to have their input to understand the complexity of the tasks. As a first pass, the product owner would come prepared with some sprint goals derived from the roadmap, and we would look at the high priority items already existing in the backlog. Most of the tasks here should already have all the information required from a pre-production pass, but it's a good chance to make sure we're aligned on the outcome, what the outcome of this task should be, and catch anything that's missing. Our backlog is very large, and we usually only scrape the tip of the iceberg during these regular meetings. So we also have a few sessions over the year to look through the entire backlog and ensure nothing important has been lost in the lower priorities. And then we would review the unprioritized tasks. On my team, we allow everyone to submit new tasks themselves as requests. For example, say an artist is struggling with font sizing on labels. They would submit a task titled, "As a UI artist, I would like fixed font sizing for labels." Then they would add details describing the problem and desired outcome of the work, as well as if it's a blocking issue. This way we can quickly see who the request has come from. This method allows us to capture all requests in one place and review them at regular intervals, which removes the overhead of me having to track that myself. As we go through each task, we add in a high-level effort estimate, which is represented as hours, days, or weeks, as that helps inform the priority. When all that's done, you should end up with a newly prioritized list of tasks ready to take into sprint planning.
All right, thank you. I typically ensure that this is done in a few steps. Firstly, I often involve the team for initial estimating of items in the backlog, either before or after meeting with the product owner, or whenever it comes up. I tend to do this ad hoc as I'm personally not a fan of planning poker and sprint planning, and prefer to use the sprint planning to verify estimates as more information is known about and the PBIs are being picked up for implementation. Generally, I set the expectation with the product owner that they should be constantly reviewing the product backlog and updating the highest priority items as information comes to light, and often book a grooming session with them to make sure that it's happening at least once a sprint. Generally, for the actual grooming exercise, I meet with the product owner and any key team members right before or after sprint review to discuss what's going on in the backlog. To me, this is geared towards preparing for sprint planning or sprint review, and some parts of the backlog grooming may actually be held in sprint review. My backlog grooming session is pre-scheduled meeting with the product owner, but I often invite other team members as their expertise is clearly valuable. One thing I'm aiming to do with the product owner is make sure that anyone estimating the work is actually the person assigned to the work. Therefore, I generally don't involve the whole team in the activity. If the product owner doesn't have their own valuing system, I usually use Moscow. That's must, could, should, or won't to review PBIs. I've seen this referred to in a few different ways, and I've seen other similar methodologies. To start with, I'll ask to review the product strategy and any additional input we might have, customer feedback, market shifts, or anything else that the product owner wants to use. And then I'll ask the product owner as we're working through it to articulate why the highest values either match that strategy or meet the value for the next sprint. I'll challenge them to make sure that it is actually in alignment with what they're saying that they need. They need to have a basic understanding of what their acceptance criteria will be, so that way they can answer questions in sprint planning. And we'll often hand it over to a team member to flesh out more fully during the sprint. Ideally, we're not missing any estimates, but if we are, or if there's not a team member missing, I will actually size the backlog items using an order of magnitude estimate, and I'll mark it as red so it's clear that it's an unvalidated estimate. And then it will get validated in sprint planning. This will tell us if we need to break PBIs down further or whether they're already ready to be proposed to the team for sprint planning. As a result of the process of picking the backlog product or the product backlog items, the owner and I usually walk away with three things: an updated product roadmap and strategy, an ordered product backlog with PBIs that have codes on them like M1, must first priority, M2, must second priority, down to the W's, which are the things that we processed and said that we're not going to do, but we leave them visible in case the idea comes up again. A few options for sprint goals. I want the team to select or refine the sprint goal rather than being forced to accept one without any discussion. So we usually aim to have maybe 1 to 3 options for them to choose from and iterate over until they've kind of massaged that sprint goal into what they want it to be. I think that's it for all of the rituals, but if we can move on to the very last slide. Being WAgile. How do you know whether or not you are WAgile? This largely has to do with the way you organize your work. Are you delivering discrete value each and every sprint? This is the minimum viable product. Ask yourself at the end of every sprint, is this potentially shippable? If not, is it because there's not enough in it yet to make a player happy? Or is it because there's absolutely nothing that you started is done? If it's because nothing is done, that's not necessarily bad, but it might be a sign that you're delivering a waterfall project using the Agile methodology. However, is it okay to be WAgile? To deliver in games, there's often 3 natural phases: your pre-production, production, and polish and release. This is a structure that is traditional waterfall, but there are reasons that these phases suit the work. Firstly, for games, the minimum viable product is usually not something that can be delivered in a single sprint, although once established, increments may well be. There's often a lot of dependencies to manage, and unless you're working with live services, there's not a lot of space in mind for a customer to do a do-over. If we ship something that's really buggy, it probably won't get a good reception. So an extended polish bug fixing period makes sense. Again, the amount of time required for these phases can exceed a sprint. It's important to recognize the source and purpose of Scrum. Scrum was developed to help new software companies disrupt the market by getting something up that was valuable fast, and then learning from their clients and adapting. Does this perfectly describe games? Probably not. Does this mean that Scrum is wrong? No, not at all. It's just that what Scrum does well, it does well. And as a framework, it may be used to, or it may need some tweaking to do everything you need it to do. Specifically, there's nothing that says you cannot build a minimum viable product in phases, just like waterfall products. For example, Scrum is very good at exploratory work where iteration is required to achieve a result. It's excellent at cutting out a lot of wasted work that can appear in waterfall products, like long documents that no one will ever read. However, it tends to be poor at managing known work with a lot of dependencies, and it relies heavily on everyone in the environment sharing the same Scrum culture and operating rhythm. Scrum fundamentally requires multidisciplinary teams that can do the work end to end, and it doesn't cope well with things like extended bug fixing periods or very large teams. That doesn't mean that Scrum is wrong or that these problems don't have solutions within the empirical framework, but it does mean that it's okay to use some tools from the traditional toolkit to deliver efficiently. For example, if you're delivering using Scrum and the company requires you to have a budget, have a budget. And if you need a bug fixing sprint because that solves a major problem for you and your team, I would encourage you to modify Scrum to do what it needs to for you. But please be careful to continue to use retrospectives to make certain that the changes that you've made are actually working for you. And thank you very much.
Cool.